alike. Obviously, like what they did there with Bernie Sanders, like the comparison to Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump, for example, is a perfect example of this. When we fact-check the claims of this anti-populist onslaught, however, we find that they miss the reality of the original populist movement as well as the many subsequent expressions of the populist credo. Again and again, upon investigation, the hateful tendencies that we are told make up this frightful worldview are either absent from genuine populism or the opposite of what it stood and stands for, or else more accurately described the people who hated populism and have opposed it since back in the 1890s. I do not point this out as merely as a historical corrective. That is just the starting point. This book has larger ambitions, as we shall see. Anti-populism always serves as a tool for justifying unaccountable power. As such, it is a doctrine worth exploring in its own right. But the immediate and urgent task before us is to rescue from anti-populist the one radical tradition that has any chance of undoing the right-wing turn. The first in any bill of charges against populism is the nostalgic or backward-looking way that's both futile and unhealthy. Among the many public figures who have seconded this familiar accusation is none other than the President of the United States, former President Barack Obama, who in 2016 criticized unnamed politicians for having embraced a crude populism that promises us to return to a past that is not possible to restore. So pretty much saying that Trump is a populist movement in some kind of way, or maybe that's pretty much what he was saying. I mean, I'm not sure I agree with that. He was, clearly taking aim at Trump's slogan, Make America Great Again, which implied that the country's best days lay in the past. Obama's understanding of populism as a politics of pointless pining for bygone glories is unremarkable, but a more accurate noun for the sentiment would be conservatism, the political philosophy that defines traditional ways. The agrarian radicals of the 19th century did no such thing. Populism called for radical reforms that would have put this country on an entirely different trajectory from the finance capital road that we followed. Indeed, the populists believed in progress and modernity as emphatically as did any big city architect or engineer of their day. Their newspapers and magazines loved to publicize scientific advances in farming techniques. One of their favorite was a paper called The Progressive Farmer. For all their gloom about the plutocratic 1890s, the populist rhetoric could be surprisingly optimistic about the potential power of ordinary people in a society that they thought that they were building. This did not mean, however, that the pops simply welcomed back whatever happened as an improvement on what happened the day before. It was not a step forward to pack the nation's wealth into the bank accounts of a handful of people who contributed nothing. Real progress meant economic democracy as well as technological innovation. Anti-populism is similarly misleading on the crucial matter of international trade. In a 2017 paper about the populist backlash of the late 19th century, Hoover Institution historian Niall Ferguson tells us flatly that hostility to free trade has always been one of the signature issues that defines populism, because populism, as he puts it, is always a backlash against globalization. Lots of other scholars say the same thing. William Galston of the Brookings Institution, for example, says that populism has been, quote, always been protectionist in the broad sense of the term, unquote, that all forms of populism stand against foreign goods, foreign immigrants, and foreign ideas. Sounds, again, a little bit more xenophobic to me. Like you're getting the terms mixed up. Like fear of foreigners, that's probably xenophobia there. When applied to Gilded Age America, these arguments are almost entirely upside down. If you look up where the parties stood on the then important issues of tariffs, you find the great champions of protectionism were in fact the big business Republicans. The man responsible for crushing populism first rose to fame as the author of the McKinley Tariff, the very definition of a backlash against free trade. It was William Jennings Bryan's Democrats who were the true believing free traders of the period. It's also worth remembering that agrarian organizations in America have nearly always supported free trade, for the simple reason that American farmers export huge amount of food, and because many of the things that farmers consume can be purchased more cheaply overseas. And sure enough, among the various manifestos, the Farmers Alliance has found the following. Quote, we further demand a removal of the existing heavy tariff tax from the necessities of life that the poor of our land must have. So yeah, really, again, anti-trade there from literally the populist, the Farmers Alliance manifesto. It's one of the early iterations of kind of the populist People's Party movement. Contemporary experts further inform us that populists feel an instinctual antagonism to government agencies. like you don't even need to have me explain why this is so BS to see what am I trying to say? For you to get it. Like, it's pretty clearly BS without me even having to explain it. I literally just told you, in, of course, part 1 as well, we talked about how farmers pretty much advocated for the formation of a hell of a lot of government agencies that were both meant to help farmers and meant to help industrial laborers as well. Like, that is so clearly not true. It's certainly true of, again, modern-day conservative Republicans, because that's kind of a different ideology, and with the Brexit supporters of the United Kingdom, who fear the unaccountable bureaucracy of the EU, and almost certainly is the precise opposite of the viewpoint of American populists. And in point of fact, the Pops came out of the reform tradition that invented the modern independent regulatory agency, and historians generally acknowledge the Populist Party with being the first to call for large-scale government intervention in the economy. So, yeah, this is on behalf of ordinary people, not corporations. The populists wanted the government to own and operate the nation's railroads, manage the currency, and to take possession of land owned by speculators, to set up postal savings banks, and a dizzying list of other inventions. The third party's hopes for government assistance were one of the things that made the Pops seem so sick and twisted to the men of respectability at the time, because the whole thing was like, yeah, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps for these people, these kind of Burke conservatives who were very kind of high-minded people, like often had close ties to, across the pond. It's like, ugh, the poor. How could they have ended up this way? Like, can't you just go and make yourself better? Isn't that possible? Like that was the mindset there. The government really is, of course, this is one of the kind of earliest students of the movement talking about this. The populist faith in the government is supreme. Like, that is the opposite of the way populists actually kind of operate. Like, to say that they're skeptical of government programs. Like, no, you're just talking about conservatives here. Like, what the hell? You don't know what you're talking about. Yeah, so ordinary working class people once demanded the government get bigger and take over vast chunks of the economy. That's what American liberalism was all about once upon a time, and it started with populism. Authoritarianism is, of course, a grave danger that always attends the rise of populism. Modern-day scholars assure us the menace of authoritarian populists, again, one of the important themes in Yasha Monk's book, kind of, again, one of the funnier ideas, because those do seem to be slightly contradictory in just a small little bit. Harvard political scientist Stephen Levitsky, meanwhile, argues that populists weaken democracies by undermining the norms that sustain them. It's clearly just people basically hinting about Trump, who is not a populist. Like, what? Like, he's definitely a faux populist. Speaks the language of the populist, but like, that is just so like shallow. It's just so clearly about Trump. It's so clearly about Trump. I don't get it. Yeah, so he says, when populists win elections, they often assault democratic institutions, he warns in his best-selling book, How Democracies Die. Yeah, so, again, if he's talking about Trump, by the way, he's right, but he's not a populist. If the original 1890s populists were authoritarians, however, they were some of history's most ineffectual tyrants. Discipline was always poor in the People's Party. The organization can never shake what the historian Charles Postel called its nonpartisan and anti-party origins. It started splitting into factions as soon as it started. I mean, it's kind of similar to what's happening now on the left. The Pops were even lousy at selling out. After endorsing the Democratic presidential candidate in 1896, they were unable to convince the Democrats to reciprocate and accept the populist choice for vice presidency. So, even then, it wasn't good. In one of the more distorted charges, virtually everyone who writes on the subject nowadays agrees that populism is anti-pluralist. So yeah, so now we're getting into we're completely describing white conservative nationalism here at this point. Which is pretty much to say that, again, that they're racist or sexist or discriminatory or xenophobic in some way. The source of this sin is said to be populism's love of the people, a concept that supposedly excludes big parts of the population from being inauthentic or ethnically different. Populism's hatred for the elite, meanwhile, is thought to be a merely fig leaf for this ugly intolerance. something like this is true in today's world, the leader of the Republican Party denounces elitists again in what he calls the global power structure, and also sets a nativist heart aflutter with his promises of a wall along the Mexican border. And so liberal intellectuals conclude the two must be connected. But again, there is no relation between people like Trump and what they do and actual Republican policies. Actually populist policies. It's a funny thing, though, again, because the example of populism once inspired intellectuals as they went about attacking racism. C. Vann Woodward, the legendary historian of the American South, writes in his memoirs that he was drawn to the subject of populism as a young man because it compelled reconsideration of the racist shibboleths of the South's Democratic Party elite. Progress, prosperity, peace, consensus, white solidarity, black contentment. The young Woodward meant to kind of shatter these stupid, stifling complacencies when he discovered the South's populist past as a graduate student in the 1930s and thought he had found the weapon to do so. This is because attacking the racist shibboleths was something that certain populist leaders famously did during the movement's brief career. The South in the 1890s was filled with poor farmers, both white and black, and keeping these groups at each other's throats was virtually the entire point of the region's traditional politics. A generation of white solidarity and indoctrination, as Woodward called it in his classic Origins of the New South, ensured poverty for both groups, but unchallenged power for the bourbon Democratic elite. So yeah, pretty much what populism would try to do is unite the white farmers of the Midwest and the industrial laborers of the Rust Belt and the big cities all across the country, and unite in the South the white farmers and the black farmers against the overwhelming white elite. And that's what the white elite on the other side, by the way, did not want them to do. That's why they used racism, the whole idea of literal white solidarity and white supremacy, to keep these people down. And if you're voting for the bourbon Democrats, you're voting for the elite. And sure, they're going to get back at black people, but your life ain't going to get much better either. That's the thing. And what's worth it? Uniting with the black people, the scary black people, oh no. Like that's what the populists would thought, so that they can unite and again push for real material changes for all. So populism's strategy for taking on the region's one-party system, as Woodward described it, was to organize a political union between white and Negro farmers and laborers within the South, a shocking affront to both racist tradition and the interest of the local money class. The Pops Woodward continued to ridicule the cliches of reconciliation and white solidarity. The bolder among them challenged the kind of cult of racism with the doctrine of common action among farmers and workers of both races. The very existence of the third party, of course, was a challenge to the one-party system as well as to white solidarity. In 1892, the populist leader Tom Watson of Georgia declared in a national magazine that the People's Party will settle the race question by addressing the common economic interest of black farmers and white farmers because, as they said at the time, and are still true now, they are identical. Watson then spoke to those farmers directly. You are kept apart that you may be separately fleeced of your earnings. You are made to hate each other because upon that hatred is rested the keystone of the arch of financial despotism which enslaves you both. You are deceived and blinded that you may not see how this race antagonism perpetuates a money system which beggars both. So that's pretty much the whole concept there of like racial unification along class lines. This is not to say white Southern populists were racial liberals or that they practiced what they preached. They weren't, and they didn't, to be fair. What they did do, however, was defy the bourbon Democrats of the South for whom white solidarity and the suppression of African Americans were the monolithic first principles of political consciousness. Populism's very existence were attacks on those doctrines. At times, the People's Party appeared to be making progress toward the stated ideal of class-based political action across the color line. Charles Postal reminds us that the marchers of Coxey's army deliberately violated segregated norms. They did not violently violate the segregated norms. They just violated them. And they were often helped along the road to Washington by black churches. In some southern states, the Pops struck fusion deals with local Republicans, which is the party to which many blacks were still loyal. By this device, for example, the Pops and Republicans were able to defeat the Democratic Party in North Carolina and take over the government for several years. Poverty has few distinctions among its victims, observed Hamlin Garland in an 1897 novel amidst the rise of populism. Describing a protest of Kansas farmers, he wrote, "The Negro stood beside, that's the important thing there, beside his white brother in adversity